You're listening to The Donor Doctor Show, where your host, James Newberry, will help you improve the health of your fundraising. Now over to James.
Hello, this is The Donor Doctor again, and we have an exciting episode today. We're going to talk about the charity rating services, and we're going to ask the question, do they do more harm than good? But before we get into that, I want to ask my son here what he thought the appropriate amount or the maximum amount a charity CEO should make. I'm talking about for a bigger charity. What do you think's the max you should make?
Well, I'm probably going to go full socialist here, and I'm going to say 150 to 200,000. 200,000 is if you're really bringing that much to the table.
Okay. Now, you know the Wounded Warriors guy that got fired. I think his name was Steve Nardizzi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. He was making like in the mid 400s, so you would say that was way too much.
Yeah, borderline corrupt, in my opinion.
Well, it's interesting though. There were other charities smaller than his in the same niche that were being paid a comparable amount, and probably didn't have the results he had.
I think that definitely what your charity is going to impact how much people like are negative towards it. The fact that the Wounded Warrior Project, it's a very public name, and I think most people support it. So they don't like. I think maybe people are more adverse to him making that much. But
they feel like they have more ownership in it.
Yeah, I think more people probably give money to that. But these smaller ones you're talking, I don't know what they are specifically.
Well, one was Fisher House, which has a great reputation, but the CEO was being paid a comparable amount. So I think you're onto something, though, that people did. He also made more enemies. If you make enemies, and Dan Pallotta, who we'll be talking about shortly, did, certainly, you're more likely to have media scrutiny, because it was really the media that took him down.
Yeah. Well, once the media doesn't like what you're doing, then...
And it wasn't just his compensation, it was the going to the resort, the 5-star resort, rappelling down the... if you saw the 60-minute episode on him. But it's an interesting thing, and people differ in their views. I asked this in a poker game, and there were two guys who said, well, charity people should be compensated just like business people, around the same amount. So they would have no problems with somebody making... and we asked, and the president makes around 400,000. That was, acceptable to them. But other people feel as you do. So I wouldn't say it's socialist. I think that kind of reflects a view that many people have, that those engaged in charity work shouldn't be paid as much, should be making a sacrifice. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad things associated with that, and we'll be talking about that. I think it's counterproductive thinking. Now, to Dan Pallotta, who I mentioned earlier, was a guy who gave a TED Talk around 4 or 5 years ago. He was a very successful guy. He did the AIDS rides, and he did breast research events. He had over 300 people working for him. He had events all over the country. You kind of participated. You put in a Tough Mudder, with Wounded Warriors, a similar type event. And it takes a lot of work. There's a lot of overhead, a lot of advertising. You want to make the user experience good. Your user experience was good, right? You would do it again.
Oh, yeah. When they do it, I think that kind of thing where, even if they were operating at a loss there, I think that the awareness that kind of event brings to your charity is definitely worth it. Not to mention the fact that the inclusion to where they actually have Wounded Warriors running in it, and they have a lot of veterans who are either sponsoring for someone who's wounded. I think that they do a lot. I think it fits the charity.
Well, I agree with you. Now, his did not lose money, but some of them took almost 80% of the cost. Now, over time, that would be less because you'd already have these people who are likely to participate in the AIDS ride or the bike ride, whatever it is.
Yeah.
But there's startup costs. It's higher at first. So that was something, that caused some media scrutiny. He had some enemies. That was part of it. Anyway, he is famous for this TED Talk that over 4 million people watched. And I'm going to, I imagine many people here have listened to it, but I'm going to summarize his 5 points. And he says we have an apartheid system. Now, you probably think that's going overboard. But he says the for-profit and non-profit sectors are treated totally different by people. First is in compensation. The average hunger charity, a CEO makes $86,000 a year. But somebody who was a Stanford MBA after 10 years would make over $400,000. So there's a huge gap right there. He says advertising. Everybody expects the for-profit world to advertise. They don't have any problem with that. But if a charity advertises too much, they have a real problem with that. But how do you gain market share if you don't advertise? How do you do an AIDS ride without newspaper ads? You want to put all leaflets? You want to? You have to advertise. He talks about risk. If a charity has an event, say a telethon or whatever it is, and it flops, like if a Disney movie flops, the CEO is probably not going to be fired unless they have a series of these. Yeah. They certainly don't think you're a scoundrel. At worst, they think you may be incompetent, but they don't attack your integrity. If a charity loses money on events and has really bad ratios, they think you're a crook, scam, that kind of thing. So that's the third problem. Time. Companies can wait. Think about Amazon, how many years they forego a profit. Or they have products like the Kindle that they don't make any money on. They break even or even lose money on it because they're trying to get market share. Now, try that for nonprofit, and you're going to get a lot of abuse, and just access to capital. So for profit does have a big advantage, and I think it makes working for a charity less desirable. It's one of the reasons why it's harder to keep talent. People, and he is interesting in his TED Talk. There were some comments, and a guy was describing what an unpleasant. Now he doesn't work in a charity anymore because it was such an unpleasant thing. You could never get any investments. They're always worried about overhead and that kind of thing. Which brings me to, in response to Dan Pallotta's talk, the three main charity rating services: the Wise Giving Alliance, GuideStar, and Charity Navigator wrote a letter, 2-page letter, on the no overhead myth. And I'd just like to read a small part of it, trying to correct the misconception that you rate a charity solely by how little overhead it has. The percent of charity expenses that go to administrative and fundraising costs, commonly referred to overhead, is a poor measure of charity's performance. We ask you to pay attention to other factors such as transparency, governance, leadership, and results. I would particularly go with the results. For years, each of our organizations has been working to increase the depth and breadth of information, That is not to say that overhead was no role in ensuring charity accountability. But many charities should spend more on overhead. Overhead costs include important investments charities make to improve their work, impressive investments in training, planning, and everything like that. One of the things that was interesting was on the back, they said they have this flyer, and it said, research shows that overhead ratio is imprecise and inaccurate. I would say that many people aren't honest, is how I would word it. But still, Americans overemphasize the number and prioritize it over demonstrated success. A 2001 survey found that over half of adult Americans felt that nonprofits should have overhead rates of 20% or less. Nearly 4 in 5 felt that overhead should be held at less than 30%. In fact, those surveyed ranked overhead ratio and financial transparency to be more important than willingness to give an organization's demonstrated success. So you have this problem that people's real expectations. You have a $50 million charity and you want to pay the guy $150,000. It's just not realistic that you're going to get top talent for so little money. I mean, you may luck out, but it's going to be hard.
You might get someone who's more passionate.
Okay.
Someone who's willing to take that low of a wage. This might be more passionate.
The overhead myth persists despite evidence that investments in overhead facilitate better nonprofit performance. and they give some stats on that. So I appreciate these rating services coming out with this letter, but it's ironic because they help create the whole overhead myth. They're the guilty ones because clients sweat this. Now, this isn't just my opinion. The Agency for International Development, they were talking about, they did a study after the tsunami relief. That was around, 2003 or 4? I forget about that.
Yeah, 2004, I think.
Okay. That all, they were all sorts of problems because people, charities wouldn't pay for assessments because that would be overhead. There were all sorts of misallocation of resources. There was one orphanage that they were looking for kids. There weren't enough orphans in their area. They gave all sorts of examples.
You say that. I took the one class I took in college about NGOs, specifically talking about how almost all these NGOs in Africa and they go into these villages and they think they don't ask anyone. They never ask anyone what they need. They just build, they'll build a well in the middle of a village. They never ask anyone if they wanted a well. No one uses the well after they build it because the people enjoyed walking to the river.
Well, one of the reasons they may be doing that is the assessment would apparently be an overhead, is what the AID said.
Maybe there's an economic reason.
And then they wouldn't share their assessment with other charities, so they wouldn't work together. It distorted the markets, what I'm trying to say. I've seen this with clients, too. They obsess with this. They don't make investments. Maybe they don't hire somebody. Even in fundraising letters, sometimes the letter is distorted to put more program in there, and it hurts results. So I find it ironic. I'm pleased that they did this, but it's ironic. So that's my first objection, and the first thing I would say against these charity rating services is the overhead myth. Notwithstanding that they did do this letter, they are responsible largely for the overhead myth. I would say also that there is a public perception that I read there too. The public has an unrealistic view of how efficient things can be. That there are going to be fundraising and administrative costs. So I think that's also a problem. But I would say that the overhead myth is my first problem. So my second objection to the charities is bias. There's a bias towards the old and established. The old and established are always going to not want competition. It's no different than the for-profit. I mean, the American car companies didn't want the Japanese. Henry Ford, as brilliant as he wasn't innovative after a certain point. He just had the Model T. They're all in black. Consumers wanted something different. So there's always going to be, and of course you have groups like the United Way, and I know there are groups that have gone, tried to make sure that they're the only group that can raise money on a particular cause, of course, which is not legal, but people, that was what people would try to do, barriers to entry. So that'd be my first. The second one is a political bias, and this is not that common, but recently Jacob Harold of GuideStar was trying to use the Southern Poverty Law Center's ratings on what constitutes a hate group to kind of to ban certain groups or to list them as hate groups. And of course, this had a number of consequences. Certain people didn't want to then match their gifts. They did decide to do, because they're going to get sued and stuff like that, decided not to do this. But what's a hate group is very nebulous. I mean, everybody understands the Ku Klux Klan is a hate group, but beyond that is there's you could say a certain church is a hate group. I mean, there's all sorts of, it depends on your viewpoints. So it's problematic. And even though GuideStar changed its mind, there's been some newspaper articles, and I would question whether this gentleman's objective enough. If you are in a charity rating, it's like a role such as an umpire, referee. You wouldn't feel comfortable if you knew the referee was betting on one team, would you? So the guy that does this rating, the Southern Poverty Law Center, is Morris Dees. He's a brilliant fundraiser, but he's very partisan. And he is someone that, because the Ku Klux Klan and the Nazis are not very big groups, that he's kind of made this, he tried to bring other groups. He lists all these other groups that really aren't what most people would consider hate groups, so that he can kind of, like any kind of group, you try to keep your cause alive. You know what I'm saying? By trying to find devils. I talk about that all the time too. You have to find a devil. So since the Klan isn't that powerful, he's made all sorts of other devils.
Conflict brings money.
Sure. So and people that he counts Nation of Islam. You remember we were in New York and we saw them. That's Louis Farrakhan's group. We saw them at Grant's Tomb. Yeah. That was them. But he has groups that speak out against Muslims and he has people against same-sex marriage and groups like that. In fact, I have a friend who works at one of these groups, Family Research Council. They had somebody went in there because he saw that listing where there's a hate group, and he shot him up. He shot at the thing, and they still have the bullet hole. So there's people that there's consequences to calling somebody a hate group. Some people lash out, and they couldn't get the matching funds, that kind of thing. So anyway, he did back off, but I do think that it's a bad odor. Once you start, you want your rating service to be neutral. If you don't want them to make them think that they're playing favorites. Like there's a home field bias, and that comes across that there is. The third most obvious one is that smaller charities aren't rated. Most of these rating services only can do a couple thousand or so. So that leaves out a lot of your charities that are $500,000 or $1 million.
Is that on purpose?
Well, they just don't have the resources to.
But doesn't that create a threshold that if you're not making a certain amount of money as a charity, if you're not rated, then people are less likely to give you money? Well,
that can be a problem. It's harder for newer, less established, and smaller ones to get in there. So but groups like that. It's like if you're in there. Let me give you an example. Cosmetologists, they want to make the entries higher. They don't want any competition. If you're already a dentist, for instance, you want to make it really hard for anybody else to be a dentist. That's that kind of thing. That's just the way things are. My third objection is it distorts the market, and I talked about that earlier. It leads to inefficiencies, poor policies being less effective. The Agency for International Development confirmed that. And the fourth one is I think it makes it less desirable as a career to work for a charity. I think it increases the turnover. I think it makes them less effective. I have here. Do you remember Gary Hart by any chance?
No.
He ran for president, and
was I alive when he ran for president?
No, he wasn't. He was in 1984 and 88. It was monkey business. He says this about Dan Pallotta. He liberates charity from its Puritan constraints and cogently attacks it to entrepreneurship. So that's one philosophy. You kind of don't really believe that. You don't believe charity should be like entrepreneurship, and a lot of people don't. Myself, I before I work on a client, I do check how much they make. I think it matters, and I kind of agree with you. If somebody is making, $60,000, and they're bringing in a couple $1 million, and they could pay themselves more, that they're dedicated. So I do think there's a certain truth to that. I don't think that you can. I wouldn't go as low as 150, but I would say 300,000 or 400,000 would be my max. And people are different. I'm not saying I'm right, but the reason I always look at the 990s is because I once had a client, and he was a good guy. He was a black preacher, and he had a mega church, over 20,000 members. And he was getting paid, I didn't know this, $500,000 a year. And you think that's probably too high, I imagine.
I mean, there's no way you could say that's not.
Well, a lot of people don't think that's wrong. I mean,
I don't doubt that he makes that money. I don't think he's stealing from that church.
You're right, but we know that was listed.
I think that it goes against what he's doing for him to take that much money.
Well, I agree with you, but people have different views on it. That's why I always look at the 990. So it is one thing that I do think the 990s are good for. But I don't know that these rating services, you have to list that anyway. I don't know what these rating services do. I mean, I think they probably do more harm than good. They themselves, when they came out with this overhead myth, which was trying to be a correction, well, they were responsible for the overhead myth. So, I mean...
How much do these CEOs make?
For the overhead? For these?
For these?
Well, I saw one of them made $160,000. I don't know.
At least they're in my...
Yeah, they were listed. I forget which one, but I did check that out, by the way. I said one of them made $160. I forget where the other two. But you're right. They do make money. I should say there's one last reason. There is kind of a holier-than-thou attitude that a lot of people have. Like, I know best. Now, from my perspective as primarily a direct mail fundraiser, people really don't care that much about. In fact, it's been tested, and the group that mentioned that they had a 4-star rating by Charity Navigator, the letter that had that, did slightly worse than the one without it, which is interesting. And the reason they thought was because then you bring in the logical rather than the emotional. You detract. Who knows?
I can see that. I don't like it myself. I don't like it's bragging. I don't think people like it when you brag.
Perhaps it comes across as bragging. I don't think so. But anyway, maybe so. I don't know.
I'm just saying, this personally.
But I mean, yeah.
You're telling me that I don't like it.
Huh. Interesting. Well, there you have it. I don't think they're bad people, the rating services. Maybe they mean well, but I do think they do more harm than good the more I've been looking into this. And so anyway, till next time, talk to you later. Bye.